discuss The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, Palestinians. The book is co-authored by Katharina Galor and Said Atshan. My name is Nadia Ali, and I'm the Director, Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. And I'm also Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies. I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce to you the participants of today's events. Katharina Galor, who is an art historian and archaeologist. She specializes in the visual and material culture of Israel-Palestine. Kati is currently the visiting Hirschfeld Associate Professor at Brown University with a joint appointment in the program of Judaic Studies and the program of Urban Studies. Her publications include The Archaeology of Jerusalem, From the Origins to the Ottomans, and the book was co-authored with Hans-Wolf Blödhorn and published by Yale University Press. She also published Finding Jerusalem, Archaeology Between Science and Ideology. Currently, Kati is writing a new book called Jewish Women, Portraits of Conformity and Agency. The book is supported by a grant from the Leo Baeck Institute in Berlin. So Kati co-authored the book with Professor Said Atshan. He's an assistant professor of peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College. Right now, Said is spending the academic year as a visiting assistant professor of anthropology and visiting scholar in Middle Eastern studies at UC Berkeley. Previously, Said was actually a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies here at Brown. And it's quite amazing because in addition to co-authoring the book with Kati, he also published a single-authored book this year entitled Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique, which came out by Stanford University Press. And it's a particular pleasure and honor to also be able to welcome Naika Furutan. She's a political scientist and professor at the Department of Social Sciences at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. She's also director of the Berlin Institute of Integration and Migration. Her research focuses on nation states transforming into countries of immigration and its implications for migration and integration politics. Her new book on post-migrant societies has been published recently, Die postmigrantische Gesellschaft, ein Versprechen der pluralen Demokratie, which loosely translates as Post-Migrant Society, Promise of a Pluralistic Democracy. So thank you all for joining me and welcome. I will be in conversation with my guest today for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. And I'd like to invite you to post your questions in the QA function if you're joining us on webinar. If you're following this event via YouTube, there's also possibility to leave questions which will be fed to us here. So I'd like to start out by asking maybe Kati first. How did the book come about? How did you decide to work on a book about Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians in Berlin? It's not an obvious choice, and to work on those issues together. You have to unmute yourself, Kati.
Well, how did it all start? It was actually during the summer of the Gaza war in 2014. I had just returned to Brown from Jerusalem, where I spent the early weeks of the war. And arriving at Brown, Bashara Dumani organized a teach-in on why Gaza matters. And there was Saed, the most junior of the discussants, and I was completely blown away by the quality of his comments. And after the event, I went up to him and we spoke for some time. And it was actually not until a week later that it was clear that we were going to stay in touch. Two of our close friends were in town, my Palestinian friend Reem and Saed's Jewish friend Hannah, and together they decided that they had to get the two of us together. So the four of us had tea on Thayer Street. And from then on, we were friends, reading each other's work.
seems that
ground on various matters, specifically, of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then when I moved to Berlin in 2016, I found out about the massive migration of Israelis to Berlin, and then also about the much larger Palestinian community. And so I suggested to Saed that we should co-author a short paper on these two communities in Berlin, and to examine the relationship to Germans. And then over the course of 2 years, we read basically all the literature on these topics and also related topics, all the scholarship, the media coverage in German, English, Hebrew, and Arabic. And then during the summer of 2018, we ended up conducting some 100 interviews with Israelis, Palestinians, and Germans who live in Berlin, focusing, of course, on the question of moral responsibility towards each other, mostly in light of past traumas and atrocities, but also in relationship to the ongoing conflict in Israel-Palestine, and how Germany is implicated in this triangle. And then the article very quickly expanded into a book-length manuscript, and the rest is really history.
Thanks. Well, what about you, Said? How did you experience the beginning?
Yeah, well, thank you, Nadia, for hosting us. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you all and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies community. I really appreciate everything that Kati just said. I'll just add a few more remarks. One is that we were blown away by the scale of migration of Israelis and Palestinians to Berlin. So there are about 25,000 Israelis living in Berlin today. And that's a really surprising number, especially in light of the Holocaust. We were utterly fascinated by why so many Israelis were drawn to Germany, of all places. So that was totally fascinating. Additionally, there are about 60,000 Palestinians living in Berlin. So it's the largest Palestinian diaspora community outside of the Middle East. And it's a really understudied community. So we were very drawn to this question about how they relate to each other and to German society more broadly. And one more point I'll just add is that Edward Said, the late Palestinian intellectual, once wrote that Palestinians are the victims of the victims and the refugees of the refugees. And that really struck with me when I first read that. And we were really curious to see what Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians in contemporary Berlin think about these questions of moral responsibility and this triangle that connects the three communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Naika, I understand from both Kati and Said that very early on, you actually played an important role and you were very supportive. So I am interested to know, so what did you see in the project and what potential did you think it had and why did you feel that you wanted to support it? Please unmute yourself.
Well, also thank you very much for being here and for having the possibility to discuss this very important book with you. I just have to say that I'm connected from Berlin now, and it's 22 o'clock. That is, I think, 10 p.m. in your language. And I just want to warn that there might be some kids looking around here who don't sleep, so don't feel afraid if you see them. Well, actually, I met Kati in the American Academy in Berlin when our colleague Nancy Foner was there. And Nancy, who is a migration scholar from CUNY, was giving a talk, and I had the pleasure to do the introduction. And so this was in the middle of the so-called migration crisis and refugee crisis to Germany. And so there were a lot of debates about the changing position of Germany within this context of the new refuge, of these moments of millions of people coming and seeking for refuge in this country, and how the position of countries like the US or UK or France were changing, and what would happen to those immigrants who have been already there. And Kati told me about Saed and her project to do these interviews in Germany. And this was very interesting because it was a moment where they were asking immigrants not only about their lives and their connectedness with each other in Germany at that time, but also how they would receive and how they would reflect the new position of Germany turning into a not only real country of immigration, but also into a kind of a new moral position. Because to be honest, Germany has changed its position and has become one of the most important players in migration topics worldwide within a very short moment of time.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's so different from when I grew up in Germany, a very different universe. Yeah, so I would like to go back to this question of the moral triangle, which is really the title of your book. And I mean, Kati touched upon it briefly, but maybe Said, if you could expand a little bit more, why the title and what exactly do you mean by it? You're muted.
So we read Noam Chomsky's book called The Fateful Triangle, which looked at the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. So our title is really inspired by Chomsky's work, but we felt that the role of Germany, the most powerful European nation in so many ways, was, and its intimate connection to the Israeli-Palestinian context was not understood in a scholarly fashion as much as it should have been. So Noam Chomsky's work was really an inspiration in that respect to sort of apply that analysis. And at the heart of our book and our question, our central question in our research is, what moral responsibility does Germany have to Israelis and to Palestinians in its borders in the contemporary context? And what we found was that Israelis, Palestinians, and Germans are very heterogeneous, and they have many different perspectives. Some who believe, especially the Germans were the most, I think, varied on this question. Some who believe that there's a moral responsibility to one community alone, to the other community alone, to both communities, to neither community. And then obviously there were Germans who were totally apathetic and couldn't care less about this question. Yeah. So we were able to capture the richness of those different points of view.
Yes. Kati, would you like to add to this?
Maybe only one small point, which is that the fact that there has been a lot of literature on the Israeli community, scholarship, and also media.
I think
it has been a phenomenon that was very. Can you hear me?
Yes, we lost you for a moment, but you're back.
So it was, it's been very shocking. It has made headlines in the Israeli media and the German media that there is this revival of Jewish life in all cities. I mean, of all cities, it's happening in Berlin. There is relatively less attention to Palestinians. There is some scholarship on their migration to Berlin. There is some media attention, but it's mostly negative and about criminality and incidents that are not very positive. And so we felt very surprised that no one brought these two communities into dialogue. And we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and not only to look at media portrayal but also dig a little bit deeper and bring these three communities really into dialogue. That was one of our main goals with the study.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember actually with great embarrassment, my first sort of proper political fight with my father. So my father's Iraqi and I grew up in Germany. And he said something critical of Israel. And I, having, grown up in Germany and going to school, I thought, that was an absolute no-go area. So, I'm sort of interested to see how, those debates actually develop. And I guess I'd like to turn to Naika here. and, you know, who has been observing the moral triangle very closely, especially in the context of the work that you're doing on migration and integration. I mean, integration, which, you know, for those of us who either left Germany or, you know, living in the US or in the UK, it's a very specific German term. And I mean, for me, it poses all kinds of problems as well. I mean, for me, I felt like when I left Germany, I escaped because I didn't have to fit in. So I'm interested to find out how you, as someone who has done all this extensive work on migration integration, what is your understanding of the moral triangle and how it has evolved over time?
Actually, the integration paradigm has changed very much here in Germany. For years, it was understood mainly as a similar term to assimilation, which was also a guiding idea in the US migration studies for years. But so it has changed within the past years, and integration is mainly seen as a moment of participation. So, and it has turned very much into a work to do for the state than being understood as something that immigrants have to show all the time. So it is understood mainly as a progressive turn to allow people to be part of the society and to be able to join the resources and to be able to join the structural, cultural, social, and also emotional realm of the broader society, while the broader society is already understood as a mixed society now. So this in theory, because if you come to the real world, there's still always a lot this idea of a core group being made out of homogeneous Germans, white Germans, that is already integrated by in the moment that they are born, and all those others who somehow don't fit even through the third or fourth generation. But actually, there is a lot changing here. You already mentioned, Nadia. So this society is made up of 26% people with a so-called migration background. And if we have a look at cities like Frankfurt am Main or, for example, Berlin, which is not really the most multicultural city of Germany. Actually, it is Frankfurt, and then it's smaller cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, München, and so on. But Frankfurt, for example, has a share of 75% children with a so-called immigration background. So these children grow up, they become part of the electorate, they vote, they somehow are here, children of the third generation or second generation. They somehow change the German, not only the German social realm, but they change politics. And within these moments of change, there's also a lot of political debates, of course, not only between Palestinians and Israelis, but that might be one of the most toxic, but there's also a lot of political debates, let's say, between people with a Kurdish or Turkish family background. So this is what we all know. When societies become pluralistic and heterogeneous, this is not always about being fine with each other. And this is why I like so much this book, because it shows within these interviews what people do think about each other and where the possibility is to get into it, to dig deeper and to somehow understand where the points of connectedness are and where there is a real misunderstanding. And of course, it is like Kati said, the picture of the Palestinian here is much less connected to positive pictures as is the picture of those Israelis coming to Berlin, because of course Germany as a society is somehow thankful and grateful that Jews are returning and coming back to Germany. And the view they have towards people coming from the Muslim world is a lot of time this idea of them coming as people who do not deserve it. And this moment of deserve deservingness and non-deservingness is very much split between these two special groups.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, that reminds me, so I keep sort of harking back to my past, but it brings back all these memories. In the 80s, I don't know if you remember, there was this book, Not Without My Daughter, Betty Mahmoudi. It's an American woman married to an Iranian who, you know, went to Iran, and then the husband, you know, turned bad and locked her and the daughter in, and then she escaped. She managed to escape through the mountains. And so they made a movie out of this. And I watched this movie with my mother in the German cinema. And then afterwards, after it was shown, my mother got phone calls from people that she hadn't heard of for years and years, and asking her, so are you experiencing similar stories with your husband? I mean, I'm laughing now, but at the time it wasn't funny.
Yeah, actually, I came from Iran just when this book was published. Right. So it confronted us very much. And yes, I mean, I suppose some things have changed, and actually some others are still very much present, and anti-Muslim discourses are still on a very high level here for years, and they have grown to an ever high after the refugees coming to Germany since 2015, and now it has stopped a little bit due to Corona. Right. So, but I'm sure that discussions will continue on that topic.
Yeah. Right. Well, going back to the actual book, I mean, one of the things that, you know, fascinates me, I think you are describing it really well, both of you, in the postscript, is the way that your respective positionalities impinged on the research process. I mean, first of all, of course, your positionalities affected the very idea or the conception of the book, and then the questions you wanted to ask. But I'm always interested in, you know, trying to complicate the idea of identity and positionality. So, I mean, clearly, you know, in terms of your nationality, ethnicity, that and family histories, very importantly shape your positionality. But it seems to me that when we look at positionality, there's more than that in terms of your values, your politics, you know, your kind of methodologies. And so I was wondering if you could both reflect on those. Maybe Kati, if you want to start.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Germany as the daughter of Holocaust survivors. My father and grandmother survived Auschwitz, but the great majority of my family perished in the camps. And so my childhood and young adulthood were very much shaped by my parents' background, their own experience as refugees from Transylvania in the 60s, by being Jewish and basically trying to figure out what it means in Germany, a Jew or an Israelite, Israelitisch, as I was referred to at school. Right. And I was also very involved in our synagogue in Düsseldorf, in the Jewish Zionist youth movement, ZJD, Zionistische Jugend Deutschlands. Right. And it was clear to me that from a very young age onward that I would ultimately make aliyah, that is to move to Israel and to become an Israeli citizen. And my commitment to dig up my Jewish life, my Jewish roots, also meant to understand my connection to the land of Israel, Palestine, to Palestinians. And so when I lived in Israel, engaging with Palestinian friends and colleagues has always been important and became increasingly significant, and a significant part in my life, in my private life, in my professional journey. So Saed and I clearly grew up on opposite sides of the conflict and have lived on either side of the wall. there is no doubt that we were shaped by our upbringing, by our parents' experiences, our families, our friends, our societies. Yet I think we both have sort of learned and also invested a lot of effort, energy, and work to analyze the situation a little bit more critically, and have come to understand that national and religious identities are constructs after all. In terms of our positionalities and politics, it's actually very simple. We always allowed ourselves to always express our own unique experiences, our feelings, our opinions as we moved through the research and through the interviews and through the writing process. And with regard to our political views, I don't think we ever had any kind of disagreements. Sometimes Saed or I were more knowledgeable regarding one or the other detail, and so we informed each other, we complemented our data sets. But frankly, I don't think that there was a single political disagreement that we had over the course of the study and this work together, at least up to the present.
Yeah, thank you. Said, what about you?
Yeah, in addition to everything that Kati just said, I think the fact that we're both based in the United States helped us tremendously, because out of over 100 interviews, very few of our interlocutors were willing to be named in the text. We had to use pseudonyms for over 90% of our interlocutors, because the issues at hand are so sensitive. And actually that for some people based in Berlin, if they were to engage in this kind of critique publicly, it could be political suicide for them. This was what a number of our interlocutors informed us. So the fact that we were based in the United States gave us a kind of freedom to be able to look objectively at the situation and to publish without fearing, in terms of any kind of professional repercussions for either one of us. I also think the fact that we're scholars gave us credibility and legitimacy with our interlocutors as well, beyond these positionalities and our different backgrounds. People recognize, okay, if you're going to talk about the moral triangle, having a German Israeli and a Palestinian scholar can really help elucidate that moral triangle. But also, these are anthropologists, these are scholars, they're analytical, they're rigorous, they're methodical, they're not polemical, they're not coming in with a preconceived notion of what's at play. We really went in with an open mind and asked our questions genuinely. And some of the conclusions we found were ones that really surprised us. And absolutely, as Kati said, we've been ideologically aligned, politically aligned. We share the same values and perspectives, even though we come from such different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. But I do remember reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes so you felt that people were reacting, of course, to you, what their sort of their what I would call sort of prescribed identity and prescribed positionality. And I think you did some interviews on your own, and you felt that sometimes, people might say something, specifically addressing you. Is that right?
Most of the interviews were with the two of us together, but there were definitely a few cases where the interlocutors preferred to meet with one or the other, or preferred to speak in Hebrew or in Arabic or in German rather than English. So we tried to be as accommodating as possible.
Yeah. Well, although you're saying that the space, the kind of discursive political space, is much bigger in US academia, and I mean, I agree on this specific issue anyway, but still, of course, there are problems and tensions and also pressures here. And one around the relationship that you look at, the very complex relationship between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which I think is also a bit sensitive here in the US. I would like to ask you to share with us, how did your respondents actually articulated that relationship, and how did you end up assessing it and analyzing it? Kati, would you like to start?
I'll be glad to talk about this a little bit. So bringing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia into dialogue was perhaps one of the most challenging tasks, and perhaps, as you just said, nowhere as sensitive and timely a topic as in contemporary Germany. Now, from a theoretical and academic perspective, it is a daring and complex enterprise that really only a few scholars have taken upon themselves. Matti Bunzel was perhaps the first scholar, Wolfgang Benz, and more recently Jasmin Schumann, and they've all gotten into deep trouble for doing so. Perhaps now it will be our turn. And Islamophobia, a very similar phenomenon with numerous historical and ideological differences, but they clearly do intersect in Europe and specifically in Germany, which has a very long and difficult history of anti-Semitism, and a more recent experience with Islamophobia, equally alarming, with incidents of abuse and violence that are statistically actually very complicated to measure, and it's even more complicated to compare the statistics, the numbers, among others, because there are about 150,000 Jews currently living in Germany, as opposed to 4.7 million Muslims. But I do want to state that Germany deals very differently with these two distinct forms of racism and violence. To put it into very simple terms, there is, for example, a federal government commissioner for anti-Semitism, Antisemitismusbeauftragter in German. His name is Felix Klein. And there is no such a position for Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. Also, there is very high security deployed around Jewish institutions and synagogues, and none for Muslim institutions or mosques. And the number of Islamophobic incidents are, of course, very alarming, but they do not get much attention in the media as opposed to anti-Semitic incidents. Now, in terms of our interlocutors' positions or answers to questions that touched upon anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, frankly, they varied so greatly that it's basically impossible to summarize all these different views of so many different individuals that come from so many different walks of life. And I do think we document and cover that very wide range of views in our books, also with lots of direct quotes. We did sometimes experience very shocking anti-Semitic statements and comments coming from Germans, also from Palestinians. We also heard terrible Islamophobic tropes and narratives, some expressed by Germans. Several among our German Jewish interlocutors expressed Islamophobic views, and also a couple of Israelis. And these were all very difficult and painful moments for us. Sometimes we were shocked and horrified, and we tried to get to stay composed and professional and very matter of fact, and not to let our emotions get into the way as we're going through these interviews. But at other times we found actually ways to laugh about some of the things that interviewees shared with us. And I vividly remember Saed jumping into the air, not during the interviews, but after the interviews, and saying, wow, this is amazing material for our books, and we absolutely have to quote him or her. Perhaps one more interesting point I would like to make in this context. There are some scholarly studies that try to document anti-Semitism among Muslim immigrants and specifically refugees. And the results are really not surprising. We can document anti-Semitism among refugees, but most anti-Semitic incidents are linked to white right-wing Germans. Mm. And there is, of course, no one who would dare to conduct a systematic study of documenting Islamophobia among German Jews. It's not something that is uncommon among German Jews. It's not so common among Israelis, I would say.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of just the reading, I have to say it was very gripping, and sometimes I, felt I had to cringe. You really provide, in a very accessible and beautiful way, provide us with these different views. So, I thought that's one thing I'd also like to mention in terms of the way that you write the book. It's complex conceptually, it's very complex politically, academically, but it's also extremely accessible and well written, and it's a kind of a page turner. So yeah, thank you for that. So Naika, I really am so curious to know how you view that relationship. I mean, not only in the context of, Israelis and Palestinians, but more broadly, because I mean, you again have this sort of more long-time historical, but also in-depth understanding, especially I guess in terms of the way that Islamophobia has changed, but also alongside anti-Semitism. So how do you view that relationship?
Well, actually, I just wanted to focus also on what Kati has said in her last sentence that is very interesting analytically, when she said, well, there was a lot of anti-Muslim racism within German Jews, but hardly any within Israelis. So this is very interesting because, of course, it's two very special groups that have been interviewed here. Israelis to Berlin are mainly a young leftist population who came recently to this town. And they, of course, if you want to, it's very hard to compare them to Palestinians who are in Berlin for most of them since the civil war in Lebanon. So they are very different in terms of class. They are very different in terms of religion. The Palestinians here are very much conservative and religious, whereas the Israelis are mainly secular and leftists. So it's no wonder that in this group of Israelis that came to Berlin, you can hardly find any anti-Muslim sentiments, because you will find less sexism there, you will find less homophobia there, but you will find it very much within the broader Jewish community here in Germany that came very much from Russia, from Poland, also very much conservative, with a lot of homophobic and anti-Muslim ideas, also very much more into traditional ideas of family. So this is why I think it's so interesting that you matched all those three groups, because only comparing those two would have been analytically very difficult, I suppose. But even though it's interesting to have their special views about the other group, so this is what I think what this book really, what makes it so special. And actually, I do think that Kati pointed on one of the most toxic positions here, because it is very difficult to compare anti-Semitism in Germany to any other kind of racist ideology. Of course, this is understandable because of the German history that anti-Semitism always has to have a very special place, but that makes it difficult for scholars if they want to bring up analogies, or they want to bring in some kind of conceptual ideas of comparison. So you always find yourself suddenly in a very toxic political debate that leads until claiming that you are denying Holocaust if you compare these kind of people-oriented positions. So this is something that has passed within the last years a lot. And I think this book is a very good moment to show how you can debate that in a sensitive and scholarly based way. Actually, this is what I could add. So if you want to ask me about Islamophobia, I can say that still during the refugee crisis, we're doing a lot of statistical work here, and there's a lot of statistics about every second German fearing that Islam is going to become too powerful in Germany, even though there's only 5% of the German population that are by Muslim origin. So there's a huge narrative of a Muslim invasion to Germany that doesn't fit the empirical data. So this mismatch between empirical data and a public narrative is also a very toxic moment. And maybe this is what I could add to your question.
Yeah, actually, can I follow up, Nika? Because I think you already kind of touched on, the specific sensitivities, and I would like to sort of push you a little bit more on that in terms of German academia, because I know from, friends and colleagues in Germany that there are lots of red lines that, despite, of course, existing also restrictions and sensitivities in the US, and there are many, but the space seems to be, broader. So what can you tell us a little bit more about the specific red lines and sensitivities of German academia around this issue?
Well, actually, we are as I already mentioned, we are here in a very special moment of time. So these change moments are so quick that even if you would have asked me this 1 year ago, I would have answered you differently. But now, the German government has decided to put up an anti-racism commission, and they actually put up an expert committee on anti-Muslim racism just a week ago. And my colleague Yasemin Schumann, who was already mentioned by Kati, is part of this committee. So, and this committee is based in the Ministry of Interior, in Ministerium. So, and this has all changed very much and dramatically because of the terrorist attacks that we had in the beginning of this year, where 9 people were killed in a city near Frankfurt in Hanau. And these people were killed in a shisha bar by a white racist. And his argumentation was a fluid mix of racist argumentation and anti-Muslim sentiments. And we had this attack on the synagogue in Halle last year, and this racist who wanted to smash the door and kill Jewish people who were praying in the synagogue, but didn't manage to get through the door, just turned around and went into a doner restaurant and shot 2 people. And he just looked for the doner kebab restaurant because he knew there were foreign Muslim Ausländer of doing this restaurant. So in the end, he killed 2 white German young people. This is where the moment where all the society somehow noticed that anti-Muslim racism is going too far and killing people in the middle of society. So right now, when you ask me, I would say even in German academia, all those things that we were discussing, that there is no such thing as Islamophobia, there is no such thing as anti-Muslim racism. I think there is no one who would just say that if this person wants to be a serious person at this moment.
Yeah, thank you. Very difficult. So I would like to, before opening it up to, I see we have some questions, but I would like to ask you both, Kati and Said, to let us know what were the highlights and also what were the most shocking experiences during the research process. Said, would you like to start?
I think that conducting ethnography in contemporary Berlin was tremendously exciting, and visiting people's homes, going to film festivals, going to parks, really understanding the social fabric of everyday life was incredible to see how Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians are living and interacting or not interacting. I think some of the responses we received were shocking and were hard to digest. I'll give just a few examples. So, for example, a German woman with whom we spoke, when we asked her, what's the difference between what is Islamophobia, what is anti-Semitism, what's the difference? She said, anti-Semitism is fear and hatred of a state, the state of Israel. That is what is anti-Semitism. And Islamophobia is fear or hatred of Muslims. So it's like, there's this initial impulse to say, wait a minute, can we interrogate that a little bit? So I have to hold yourself back and just sort of like take a deep breath. And as Kati said, just keep it, for the book. Or for example, a young Israeli man who was in the tech industry, not progressive like most Israelis in Berlin, who said, anti-Semitism is totally irrational. It's fear and hatred of Jews just because they're Jews. Whereas Islamophobia is actually a justified and very rational fear and hatred of Muslims. It's actually grounded in a reality. So Kati and I are, again, looking at each other, trying to figure out, okay, how do we deal with this? Or another example, a young German woman who's of migrant background wearing the hijab, and she was very emotional. And she said, people keep talking about anti-Semitism and no-go zones for Jews and for Israelis in certain neighborhoods in Berlin. And she said, but we know that many Jewish people and Israelis live in those exact neighborhoods. And she said, but nobody talks about no-go zones for Muslims. And she said, I, as a woman wearing the hijab with my children, there are parts of Berlin that I'm afraid to walk in because I'm worried that we could be attacked at any moment. So I think that capturing those narratives and capturing the richness of everyday life was challenging, but also very exciting. And we tried to do justice to that in the book.
Thank you. Kati, what about you?
So for me, I'll start with the worst part of the study, and then with the best part of the study, the highlight for me. So for me, the most shocking experience was encountering Germans who were happy to see this revival of Jewish life in the city, but through this Israeli migration, but who were not prepared to accept Israelis' political positions. As a result of the Israeli migration, the Israeli community is really very palpable in Berlin. You hear Hebrew in the streets, there are many Israeli restaurants and cafes and cultural and social events. And so Germans love that. And they're genuinely proud that Jews have once again a place in Berlin and that they can consider it their home. Mm-hmm. Now, the complication is, as Naika earlier said, is that most of these Israelis are relatively young, they're relatively liberal, left-wing, critical of their government, critical of Netanyahu. And since for Germans, and according to the German legal definition, Israel criticism is a form of anti-Semitism, there are now Germans, an actually good number among them, who will define some Israelis as anti-Semites, Israelis who can be perfectly good Jews and even practicing Jews. And for me, this was really outrageous and unbearable. Mm. So this was, for me, the worst part. The highlight of the research process was, frankly, working with Saed. Saed is awesome. Some of our research was was emotionally very difficult, talking about the Holocaust, talking about the Nakba, talking about violence, hate, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. After a while, it can be pretty heavy and difficult. And Saed was always there for me in those difficult moments, and always knew how to engage these topics intellectually and emotionally. And I hope it was mutual. I think it was mutual. And then also, I would say, as scholars, I love the fact that Saed comes from a completely different background, using different methodologies and totally different tools. So I really loved the interdisciplinary experience, not to mention our very different personalities and working habits. And so I really think we complemented each other very well. And also another highlight for me, just like for Saed, was meeting so many amazing people in Berlin. Many have become dear, dear friends.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the questions. We have a few, and if you don't mind, I'm going to gather a few and so then ask you to respond. So there is a question from Sarah Willen, who first thanks you both for the book. And she has two questions. One question, could you tell us more about your Palestinian and Israeli interlocutors' views of Germans and expectations of Germany? I think an excellent question. And then secondly, she asked, in addition to learning about these groups' views of each other, did you learn much about the fabric of interaction between Israelis and Palestinians in Berlin? Given the context Professor Fouetin offers, this sounds unlikely, and yet I imagine there is at least some. And I also would like to read out a question in the chat, which came via YouTube. So the question is, did those interviews took place only in Berlin? If also in other cities, regions, are there differences, and what kind of, and you know, can you sort of think maybe Maika can help us to think around this as well? And then I take one more question. Actually, yes, it's a series of questions, but this is by Fethi Kelis, who is asking, it would be interesting to know more about the essential identity terms, German, Israeli, Palestinian. How are they being operationalized in this project? What forces, discursive or otherwise, get to authorize who gets to be called a German, Israeli, Palestinian? And secondly, how are these identities intersecting within the same personal or institutional space? What are some of the ways in which intersectional identities may get locked up in the moral triangle? And finally, was the project based on interviews only, or was there participant observation involved? Were there differences between how your interlocutors may have performed their respective identities in their conversations with you on the one side, and in the ordinary course of their everyday lives on the other side? Okay, I realize these are lots of questions, but maybe that's, you know, I think I suggest you don't have to answer all of them, but maybe, you know, different people pick any. Naika, I was wondering maybe if you want to pick up any of those questions. Is there anything that sort of speaks to you? And maybe the sort of question around differences between Berlin and other cities in Germany. Could you say something around that?
Yes, and maybe I could also say something about the topic of identity, and especially German identity, because it's very much discussed here, and it's very different, I think, from the US notion of citizenship or being naturalized or being part of the public narrative. Of course, as I already mentioned, cities in Germany are very diverse in terms of immigration and in terms of immigrant groups. We can truly say that the highest numbers of Israelis in Germany is actually living in Berlin. So having caught this city for the interviews is empirically accessible as an idea. And even though there's also Palestinians in Cologne and also in Frankfurt, but also we can say that there is really a high base in Berlin and in Frankfurt. And we already mentioned, and I think we discussed it, that what is also interesting that in terms of attachment and effectiveness, of course, this is very, it's two different groups. So people, as you already said, Kati, love Israelis, but they don't care about Palestinians here, or I could even say they don't like them very much. So this is also in terms of sympathy and antipathy, very different groups. So therefore, for looking into most different groups, this is a very interesting case study. And in terms of identity, you know, we measure the migration background in the German statistics until the second generation. So if you are born here already to a German mother and only your father has a so-called, has been an immigrant, so you are also counted in the statistic as an immigrant or a person with a migration background. That makes the numbers so high. This is how people are counted. And to be honest, if we look into the data, we could say more than 90% of those children under 18 who firm as person with a migration background in the statistics are also German by passport. So we could call them German if we want, but as it is not seen like this, if you are phenotypically or visibly noticeable as a person who doesn't look as a typical German, although we could discuss what the typical German is, people are mainly seen and perceived as Ausländer. And we experience very much that the third generation is turning into a moment of distance, recalling and renaming themselves as foreigners. Which is really funny because most of them even don't speak the language of their parents, but they describe themselves as foreigners, some very proudly, and some even do not think about this, that they could be German even though they have the German passport. So the issue of identity is, of course, also challenged very much from the right wing that are bringing into play a notion of homogeneity as being a homogeneity of blood and ancestries. But we had in Germany the law of blood, the blood law until 2001. This blood law changed in 2001. So now you can become a German even though your ancestries have not been German. Maybe so far to say a little bit about German identity. We can also discuss that further on if there are more questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So about the question in terms of your interlocutors' views of Germans and expectations of Germany, would like to speak to that?
I'm happy to do so. We found among Palestinians 3 groups. There are those who are of lower socioeconomic status who are facing significant economic insecurity and legal insecurity in German society. And they report very high levels of anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, and they feel largely alienated from broader German society and that Germany doesn't care very much for them. We also found that middle-class Palestinian Germans who had economic security as well as legal security, there was an overwhelming sense of affinity with larger German society, a sense of desire to integrate, to assimilate, and a sense that there was solidarity between them and between other Germans more broadly. So that was encouraging. And then there are elite Palestinian Germans who wield significant financial capital, social capital, cultural capital, and overwhelmingly those Palestinian German elites shared a sense of suffocation, experiencing censorship, a sense that if they were to openly express their Palestinian identity or critiques of Israeli state human rights violations in Germany, that this would be political and social suicide, and that their contributions to German society are invisible, and their creativity and ingenuity is just not legible in broader German society. So that was disheartening. Among Israelis, their perceptions of Germans, there was a recurring theme of a desire to be quote unquote normal. This kept coming up over and over and over. So they would say, of course, we don't like anti-Semitism, and we're alarmed by the rise of the neo-Nazis and the far right in Germany, and we worry about anti-Semitism, but we also don't appreciate being fetishized either. So there's a kind of like philo-Semitism or philo-Semitism that makes a lot of Israelis in Berlin very uncomfortable as well. They don't like this performative, enthusiastic response that they get when they meet, you know, average Germans who find out that they're Jewish Israelis and want to prove to them that they love Jews and they love Israelis. So they just said, we just want to be normal. Stop, you know, this in this direction or that direction.
Yeah, I remember feeling quite touched reading that. So, Kati, I wonder whether you can say something about the second question posed by Sarah Willen, which is, you know, the fabric of interaction between Israelis and Palestinians in Berlin, and maybe you could connect that to another question that I actually had in mind, which was one chapter was about this very rich cultural artsy scene in Berlin. I mean, Berlin is such a cool city anyway, but what makes it so cool is also this sort of very dynamic, vibrant, you know, cultural scene and people coming together. And so can you say something about that fabric?
Yeah, so first of all, someone I think asked whether the interviews all took place in Berlin or whether we also conducted some interviews in other cities. And I just want to briefly answer, yes, all the interviews were conducted in Berlin and no other city. And the reason why we picked Berlin as a case study is because it has the largest Israeli community. There's somewhere between 10 and 40,000 Israelis living in Berlin. And it's also the largest Palestinian community in Germany, but in all of Europe. The estimates range between 40,000 and 80,000. And the reason why both communities are really difficult to pin down in terms of statistics is, well, there are many, many different reasons, and we go into quite a bit of detail in the book. There's a whole chapter about numbers. So for Israelis, it's because many Israelis have dual citizenship. Several Israelis live between 2 or 3 cities, and some go and come and don't register, or register and then leave but don't. So the statistics are very complicated. A lot of Israelis are also German citizens or have some other European citizenship. For Palestinians, the estimates are even, I mean, the range is even broader, and it's very difficult to pin down how many Palestinians live in Berlin, because many came through Lebanon as refugees, and over the years, Germany has changed its way to classify Palestinians, and so they very often fall between. I mean, they don't count, and so it's very, very difficult to bring exact numbers. And for our book, we just decided to go according to the way people identified. Some Palestinians had Israeli citizenship, but they identified as Palestinians. Some Germans with German citizenship were Turkish, and they felt that this was a very important part of their identity, and we incorporated these identities into our interviews and into the evaluation. The question about Israeli and Palestinian interaction in the cities. So obviously it is much easier for Israelis and Palestinians to interact in the city of Berlin, outside of the conflict zone. And so we observed a lot of spaces where they come together. And it's actually quite interesting that one of the highest concentration of Israelis and Palestinians are in Kreuzberg and Neukölln. And white Germans usually associate in particular Neukölln with a no-go zone. It's a place with many immigrant communities, and they're dangerous. And those are the places where many of the Israelis feel very comfortable and many of the Palestinians feel very comfortable. And so this gives them a lot of opportunities to interact. And we have also met or interviewed a number of Israelis and Palestinians who actually live together or have close friendships. And so we found that very touching. There are also various organizations, some of which we studied and talked about in our book. Those are unfortunately still unique places, and it's the minority of these populations who actually live together or interact together. But these are visible spaces and visible interactions, in particular in the realm of the art scene. So yes, maybe I should answer your question now, Nadia. The creative artistic forms of expression and engagement. Well, I think the best example is really the work of theater director Yael Ronen. We actually begin our preface and we end our conclusions with her and her work. And she basically put on stage what we engaged intellectually in the streets of Berlin and then ultimately translated into a book. So Yael Ronen began her international career with a play called 3 Generations that was going to be performed at the Habima Theater, which is Israel's national theater. And that play engaged the relationship between Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians. And the government, the Israeli government, actually tried to prevent this from happening, but it was ultimately performed anyway, and that ultimately launched her career big time. And for the last 5 or 6 years, Yael Ronen has been an in-house director at the Maxim Gorki Theater in Berlin, where she now also directs another play called The Situation, which is very, very inspiring, which we went to see together with Saed. And this play too is about the relationship among Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians. And this time it's located in Berlin. And it is performed by German, Israeli, and Palestinian actors who play various versions of themselves, and they talk in their mother tongues. There on the stage in Berlin, they talk in German, in Arabic, and Hebrew. And so this was really a great experience, very inspiring. There's also perhaps another example is Daniel Barnboim, Israeli, and I mean Israeli in passport. There's this music academy that he established together with Edward Said, and the program that they've built mostly around classical music that brings together Israelis and Palestinians. Talk a little bit about that in our book. Then there's also another example that comes to mind. There's Circle One Gallery that exhibits work by Israeli and Palestinian artists, sculptures, paintings, and but there's, of course, also Israeli and Palestinian artists who work independently, that is not as a joint endeavor. 2 artists that come spontaneously to mind are Salim Ashkar, a world-renowned pianist who's originally from Nazareth, but who's lived in Berlin for a decade now. And an Israeli artist, Yael Bartana, she's a filmmaker, photographer, and she also has an international career, and she lives between Berlin, Tel Aviv, and Amsterdam, which is very typical for many Israelis. So some of these artists in Berlin engage their identities and politics and also the issues we touch upon in the book, but others don't, and may actually find that it's very liberating not to always have to talk about their identities and the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I find it interesting the way that, I mean, in the 90s, London was very much the center of the intelligentsia, the intellectuals and the artists and the opposition of the Middle East. And now it really has shifted to Berlin. I mean, it's also, aside from, of course, Israelis and Palestinians. When I was there last time, lots of my Egyptian friends ended up there. And of course, Syrian, and then clearly the large Turkish and Kurdish community. Iraqis as well. I mean, there are lots of Iraqi intellectuals and artists. Actually, I want to go back to one of the questions that Fethi Keles posted, and I find really interesting and important, which is the question about the ways that maybe some intersectional identities may get locked up in the moral triangle. And so myself, of course, immediately I'm thinking gender and sexuality. I mean, you mentioned class, in terms of class being an important variable shaping people's experiences of Germany, access to resources, networks, and so on. But you don't speak much about, gender or sexuality, but we know that specifically in terms of the Israeli migration, I mean, there's a whole queer migration from Israel to Berlin. And so, I'm wondering if you could maybe decide to start out, how does gender and sexuality come into play, and how might people's very, fluid intersectional identities might get locked up in this triangle?
Yeah, well, I think that the question of queer migration from Israel to Germany is a fascinating question. And a wonderful scholar who's Israeli based in Berlin now, Hilla Amit, A-M-I-T is her last name, has done really fantastic work on this question, and I highly recommend her work. I would be interested in some of Naika's thoughts as well on this question of intersectionality. So, and it is very clear in our book that gender and sexuality was not a focus of our particular research, but I think that it becomes very relevant with questions of perpetrator and victim, where the lines between perpetrator and victim are very, very much blurred. So many of our interlocutors recognize that it's not always black and white, and that obviously there are internal systems of oppression within one's respective communities, for example, within Palestinian society. I think a powerful moment where these intersectional identities and the complexities became clear, and this question of victim and perpetrator was fascinating. We spoke with a Palestinian woman living in Berlin who said that she always saw herself as a victim, given her Palestinian identity, growing up under Israeli military occupation, etc. But that moving to Berlin and spending time there and meeting people from all walks of life meant that she started to become close with a number of Kurds, people who of Kurdish origins. And they began to explain to her that they see her as an Arab, like this is another aspect of her identity, kind of ethnic identity, and that Arabs, from the perspective of Kurds, historically speaking, have been a perpetrator community, and that even within Palestinian society, Yasser Arafat was known to have supported Saddam Hussein, even as Saddam Hussein in Iraq was gassing Kurds, etc. So from the perspective of a Kurd, Palestinians and Arabs more broadly it's very uncomfortable to have to deal with these identities and these histories that people inherit. And so she shared with Katia and myself that it was in Berlin for the first time that she realized that she was associated with the perpetrator community without even being fully conscious of it, and that was something she was working, trying to reconcile, and we found that to be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, Naika, I'm curious to hear your views on that specifically, because I'm aware that so gender is, of course, very much, gender differences is very much instrumentalized in Germany. It's not just in Germany. I think it's more broadly in constructing and demonizing Muslims. Gender and sexuality is very key to that process. Can you reflect a little bit on these intersectional identities as the tensions are playing out, especially vis-a-vis Islamophobia and anti-Semitism?
Well, actually, you already mentioned that there's mainly three important topics when you want to argue pro-Islamophobia. One of that is those people are oppressing women. The other one is they are homophobic and the last one is they are anti-Semites. And all those three moments, or these three kind of discriminating sentiments, are something that, by pointing to the Muslims, the German population can somehow think that they got rid of these moments of, this is some part of their history maybe, but not a moment of identity of their Germanness. And of course, there's no moment to deny, and this is what Kati and Syed both said, that in their interviews they had harsh anti-Semitic moments within their interlocutors who were Palestinians. So there's nothing to deny about anti-Semitism within Muslim people here, and homophobic positions. And also, we all know, especially those of us who have lived in those countries, that the position of women in Islamic countries is, of course, not comparable to those in democracies here. But still, it is, as Kati said, if we look into the latest data on our criminality reports, it's more than 95% of right-wing anti-Semitic criminal reactions are coming from the far right. And the far right is getting more powerful every day here, as far as the German Chancellor and the Minister of Interiors have pointed out that the biggest problem we do have in Germany right now is the problem with right-wing, not populism, but extremism. And therefore, I think we passed the last 10 years focusing very much on the Muslim population and somehow forgetting about the right-wing networks that were growing and growing and getting more and more powerful. Therefore, I think it's quite, oh, my son is over there. I think this is something we have to have in mind, but actually it's very difficult to discuss, because it always seems like an apologetic moment, as if you want to apologize and if you want to say, no, it's not so bad with my own group, please have a look at the other group. So it's something that I think this book makes us understand. We can discuss those things at the same time. We can have a look at anti-Semitism within our own social group and also compare it to the anti-Semitism of the others, or of the majority society who is ruling in the end here. Actually, I also do think that maybe what is very interesting is that Kati and Syed had difficulties to promote their book here in Germany. Maybe this is something that seems a little bit weird, because if we look at the book and at the topic, we would think this should be something that comes very much in time. We're talking about a new immigrant population, which are Israelis, and we're talking about a huge conflict, but actually there was no way to find a place to promote this book. Actually, I invited Kati and Syed at Humboldt University, and as far as I remember, I was the only one, wasn't it? But actually we couldn't do it because of Corona, but maybe you can say something more on that, Kati, because for the people there, it would be interesting to know about these conflicts.
Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety about bringing these issues into dialogue. A lot of Germans feel very nervous about having a Palestinian speak at the university, which is really devastating. I mean, to me, it's, I mean, we have the same kind of education and standing in US and international academia, but in Germany, it is not only about your academic credentials. It is about your national identity, and this for me is very disturbing, because we wrote a book together.
I think it might be more because of the critique.
An Israeli Jew who will talk in German academia and a Palestinian who will say exactly the same thing. And so this is what we encountered a little bit. George Khalili did invite us. The American Academy in Berlin. But it is true that there has been, I mean, on an individual level, a lot of colleagues were extremely excited about the book and so looking forward to the publication and have read it, and we get lots of messages from individuals. But there is some anxiety around a Palestinian being a scholar, a professor, an intellectual, being educated at Harvard, going straight from the West Bank to Harvard is very disturbing, I think, to many Germans.
Naika, you wanted to come back on that?
It is not so much Said being a Palestinian scholar. I think it's more what you mentioned before. It is because some people do not want to hear critiques towards Israel coming from Jewish people. And I think this makes this book so difficult for the German audience. And of course, we know that any critique coming from Jewish people, or especially from Israeli people, towards oppression in Israel is somehow framed around the issue of the BDS movement. And that makes it very, very difficult to have panels where exactly this composition can be shown.
Yeah, that actually leads me to a question by Dr. Ghazi, who posed several questions, but the most relevant here is the recent law in terms of criticism of Israel to equate that with anti-Semitism. And he is asking, what were the discussions that led to the decision? What are the main points of thinking? And asking as well, might the law be overturned, or better yet, replaced with a more nuanced law? So maybe Naika, can you start us off? Because I know that you're very tuned into those debates.
Well, actually, there was a long debate about looking for a new definition of anti-Semitism because, as Kati said, there is a new Antisemitismusbeauftragter. I don't know how to translate that into English. A commissioner for anti-Semitism. So while the German government had put this position into play, they had to define what this commissioner had to look at if he is commissioned to look at anti-Semitism. And therefore, there were a lot of discussions looking into international definitions of anti-Semitism. And while these debates within the past years were very much connected to how to position towards or against BDS, these debates somehow got into the German debate and influenced very much the parliamentarians, so that not only the parliamentarians decided to favorize this harsh definition, but they also asked universities and other public spaces to agree with that. That has led to the moment that we in public spaces are not allowed to invite persons, even if they would be our colleagues. I mean, we had a big debate on Judith Butler being invited by the Jewish Museum. So we cannot invite them as scholars to speak on a very different issue. Speaking about gender and inviting Judith Butler is something that is very logical. So not being allowed to invite her because she is supporting BDS brings us into a very strange moment that we have to check up the CVs of every colleague that we want to invite, because German newspapers make it up So we invite someone, and then they bring into the newspapers, this person has been into a conference speaking where another person has been who has been favorizing BDS. So this idea of a contact that brings you already into a moment of being a supporter is something that is very difficult for us in academia now dealing with.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of conscious of time, and I'd like us to say a little bit about, your conclusions, but also vision forward in terms of the idea of restorative justice. There's one question posed to you here. Does the book come to conclusions or recommendations how to change to more acceptance and integration, like availability of workplaces for all groups, government support of interaction, lessons in school? And I would like to add to that your reflections in terms of what might restorative justice look like in the context of the moral triangle. So maybe if I ask Said to start us off.
So it's, as we think about the future and we think about restorative justice and we think about this triangle, it's really interesting to see how much has been done between Germans and Israelis. There's been significant progress in terms of healing, recognizing the past, coming together. It's quite inspiring to see how much dialogue there is and this kind of restorative framework between Germans and Israelis. It's also really interesting to see the Israeli-Palestinian side of the triangle as well, where we have a whole chapter on points of intersection, and we argue that actually contemporary Berlin is in many ways a post-Zionist context in which Israelis and Palestinians can interact without the weight of Zionist oppression and segregation between them. But what's fascinating is that it's this German-Palestinian part of the triangle that's the most fraught, and where there's so much work that needs to be done in terms of healing and in terms of restorative justice and in terms of recognition of moral responsibility. So one of the major things that we call for is compassion. Really the need for Germans to extend compassion to Palestinians in a way that they've extended to Israelis. It's beautiful, the kinds of compassion that has been extended towards Israelis, and it would be wonderful to see more compassion extended towards Palestinians as well.
Yeah. Kati?
I'm not sure if I can add anything. Maybe one of the conclusions we also reached is that there is a significant gap between governmental positions, official policies, and civil society and people on an individual level, that there is more understanding of a better understanding of the situation and more compassion towards Palestinians than on an official level. And there is more criticism of Israeli right-wing politics when it's not made in public. So we noticed this gap. So our hope is that civil society will emerge and impact official policies, and hopefully, I mean, what we observed and what we discuss in the book is that there is some sort of censorship when it comes to bringing these issues into dialogue and to talking about Israel and having a place to be sometimes critical. One can embrace Judaism, one can embrace Jews, one can embrace Israelis, but still be critical of Israeli right-wing politics. And I think it is still extremely complicated to do so in Israel, and there's a sort of censorship around this issue. And I think once there is more realization that there is this censorship, I think we can move forward.
Well, I think the pleading for more compassion is an excellent way to stop this discussion. And I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, for your work. Nika, for joining us so late. I'd like to say that this event is recorded and we'll be making it available in a few days so you can share it with friends and colleagues. So goodbye, everyone, and many thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.